for over 20 years. And as a practicing attorney, I get involved from time to time in educational issues, but mainly what I get involved in is contracts gone bad. So I get involved when someone did a poor job of drafting up a legal document and it gets really messy and people start pointing the finger at each other. And that ties into what I'm going to be talking about today. I also spent about 15 years involved on a charter school board. I was involved in helping create Canyon Rim Academy, a K-6 charter school here in Salt Lake County. And I was the chair of the board for several years. I've stepped out of that responsibility here in the last year or so. But during the time I was on this school board, I had a lot of involvement in drafting policy. Part of that was because I was the one lawyer on the board. I had a lot of involvement in drafting legal documents. And so that experience is what's going to color what I'll be sharing with you today. My experience as an attorney and my experience being involved on a charter school board for several years. So let's get right into it. And I know that we've got several folks on the call. If you've got a question, by all means, please cut me off and just jump right in with any comments or questions that you have. If you find an appropriate time, just go for it. I'll certainly make some time for questions at the end as well. But just cut me off if you need to. So, all right, what I want to start with is I just want to lay out the differences between or among bylaws, policies, and procedures. Bylaws are a legal document. They're a contract that lays out all the legal parameters for the operation and governance of the school. Bylaws are typically put in place after the company is formed. So the corporation, the actual legal entity that has its contract or its charter with the authorizer. Bylaws can be amended from time to time. They aren't necessarily static, but whatever your final version of bylaws is going to be binding on the governance of the school. So if you don't have bylaws in place, make sure you put some bylaws in place. That's something that should be drafted. Typically, it's drafted with the assistance of legal counsel, but it doesn't have to be. But I would certainly recommend that you do have bylaws in place that were drafted by an attorney working with the school. I won't spend any more time today talking about bylaws. Just wanted to get that out there. The next thing is policies. Policies are the rules that are defined by the leadership of the school that lay out all of the expectations for everyone involved, all the stakeholders, and they lay out how those expectations, what happens to those expectations when there's a violation of some kind. And lastly is procedures. Procedures are what codify or what lay out the school operations, how operations are to happen. Now there's some overlap here. We'll talk about that here in just a bit. Typically, when you're drafting school policies, you include procedures. Not with every policy, but there's certain policies where you need to lay out the procedure that's followed in order to enforce the policy, for example, if it's violated. Typically that spills over into procedures. So why is it important to draft effective policies? First is to just make sure all the expectations are laid out for everyone, all the stakeholders involved. Make sure all the boundaries are laid out. Make sure everyone's role in the school is laid out. Parents, students, administration, faculty, staff, other employees. Next is to try to reduce the need for the board to be getting involved day to day in the operations of the school, and to make sure that the school itself, the administration, has the ability and the discretion to be running the school day to day without always having to get permission from the board. You want to lay that out in writing in your policies, and that's how you can keep the board off filling its role with you as administrators running the school day to day. Next, policies are essential to protect you from liability, to protect you from lawyers like me that are off filing lawsuits. You want to make sure that the school itself, you want to make sure that you as an administrator and all of your employees are insulated and protected from liability. And you do that by putting in place effective policies and making sure that they're followed. And lastly, we need to come back to the reason that you are here, that we're all here, which is to make sure that children are being educated. That's the goal. And by putting good policies in place, that can remain your focus and what you do day in, day out. The focus is on the kids. So today's seminar or training is a little interesting because it really is the school board who has the responsibility of putting in place effective policies. But the reason you're here and the reason we're having this training for you is that the school board members, being on a school board is not their day job. They all have busy lives. They have other things that they're doing. They're not getting paid to be on their school board. So this is really where you come in helping the board understand what policies need to be in place and helping actually put those policies in place. So that's why we're talking to you today. They really need your help as administrators. So let me talk now about where to start in drafting policies. There are lots and lots of resources that are available to you to help you put policies in place. And I presume that all of you have already plenty of policies in place. The starting point in preparing policies is to know, number one, what you have to have in place. And you need to make sure that you have those policies in place. And I'll jump around here just a little bit. There are a couple things I want to show you on my screen to try to get you to some of the resources that you have available. And let me just navigate there real quick. All right, so there are a few places for you to start as you're looking for where to find policies. And I'm going to bounce around through some of these sites really quickly. You should know already where all of these things are located. And I've included at the end of my PowerPoint, if anybody wants it, hyperlinks to all of these sites. But if you just want to track me for a little bit here, the first place for you to go is the State Charter School Board website. If you go under the heading Run a Charter School, there's a link for guidance and procedures. When you click on that link to guidance and procedures, it takes you to this page right here. And under the heading Required and Suggested School Policies, there's a hyperlink that actually takes you to a PDF that has been prepared that lists all of the required and suggested school policies State Charter School Board has come up with. And that at least lists out for you the policies that you need to have in place. So my recommendation to all of you and my encouragement to all of you is that you regularly go to this page and that you refer to this sheet to just make sure that you have those required policies in place. This is updated from time to time. It's not updated several times a year, but from time to time it's updated. And I suggest that you look to it from time to time. It's a good long list and it's a pretty extensive PDF. Second place I suggest that you go to, if you go to the Utah State Board of Education website, they have a link on their site to policies. and specifically model forms and model policies. And this includes things that I know are on the state charter school board's list that I just referenced for you, but this actually includes model policies. You can pull up, if you don't have a bullying, cyberbullying, hazing, retaliation policy, pull up the model policy that you have here from the State Board of Education, and that's a good starting point. We'll talk in just a sec about what you do with these forms. Next, I would direct you to the Utah Association of Public Charter Schools website. On their site, and let's see, I just need to move that. On their site under resources, they have a link to sample forms and policies. And here you've got a number of different topics for administration, special ed, finance. There are lots of examples here where they've come up with some model forms and policies. So that's also a great resource. One more link that I'll send you to, this isn't where you go necessarily to find policies, but while I have this screen up, let me just direct you to this under trainings on the Utah State Charter School Board website. When you click on trainings and then under the link of governance, it takes you to all of these training modules that were prepared with the assistance of the association. And one of those that I think is excellent and bears on what we're talking about today is just entitled Policy Book. It's a 10-minute training. I suggest that you take 10 minutes, and this would be nice also for a training in a board meeting, to just take 10 minutes and train the board on policies, the importance of having effective policy. And there's some tips that are provided on drafting effective policy. All right, that's a long list of resources. Let me switch gears just a little bit and talk about what to do once you have a form. So it's great to start with a form. If you've got an example of a policy that you can start with, that is a great starting point. But what I want to caution you about today is to make sure that you use that just as a starting point. Every school is a little bit different. Sometimes the law changes, as we see in education. Every year, the law changes in one way or another, and you've got to keep abreast of those changes in the law. And the same goes for your policies, which rely on and cite the Utah Code and regs and other legal provisions. You need to make sure that you're keeping on top of things by reviewing the sample and making sure that it's current, that it cites the right law, and that it is uniquely changed or modified so that it fits whatever is unique about your school. So don't just pull a sample and throw it out on your website. Make sure that you go through it very carefully to make whatever changes are needed so that it suits your school. So let's talk for just a sec about the elements of an effective policy. You start with the title. Make sure that the title is clear. Make it short and simple. It doesn't have to be extremely long. Don't try to throw the policy into your title. Just keep your policy really simple so that it can be easily found. Next, in drafting policy, I always like to start with some brief statement of purpose. It's typically one sentence, maybe two, that just states the purpose of the policy in very general, simple terms, what you're trying to accomplish or the rationale for having a policy. Sometimes policies are really, really simple, and it's just a short and sweet policy that you have to have in place. And maybe in those circumstances, you can just dispense with a statement of purpose. But I always like to start a policy with a very clear statement of why this policy is in place. Secondly, and most importantly, you then have to have an accurate and succinct statement of what the policy is. And I'll give you some tips on that here in just a moment. Next, the next element, you don't need this in every policy, but from time to time, you may want to have some clearly defined procedures for how this policy is to be enforced or applied, and what's to happen in the event that the policy is violated. It's good to include some of those procedural statements right there in your policy. There's not a need to have a separate procedure. So for example, you've got a bullying and hazing policy. You don't need a separate bullying and hazing procedure. You can have procedures actually in your policy for what happens to enforce it and what happens if it's violated. And then the last thing that I would include in every policy, it should be printed on the page of your policy, is the date that the policy was put in place. Or if it's an update or a change, the date that it was updated, the date that it was changed. And that should tie to the board meeting at which the policy was actually approved. So keep your policies up to date, and as we'll talk about in just a sec, and make sure that as you're keeping them up to date, you actually print the date on your policy. That way, if there's any doubt about the policy, someone is able to look at the policy, it has the date on it, and then track that back to the board meeting minutes or even the board meeting recording from that date, if there's any doubt about whether that policy was put in place. Don't just leave it open-ended and not have a date on it. Okay, so let's talk about some characteristics of effective policies. First and foremost, and I would say most important, it just needs to be clear and concise. By concise, I mean short. You don't have to throw the kitchen sink into the policy. You don't have to explain every conceivable justification for the policy. Try to keep it as short and sweet as you can. You'll notice that some of the foreign policies that come from the state are very long, and there's some reasons for that. Sometimes some of the procedures require a lot of detail. It's okay to be detailed, but try to keep it as concise as you possibly can. The problem with a longer policy, the more you say, oftentimes the more you're running a risk of having a lack of clarity or having an ambiguity. So try to keep it as short and sweet as you possibly can, while still covering all of your bases. Secondly, make sure that there are no ambiguities in your policies. Ambiguity is a word that we use a lot in contract interpretation and enforcement as lawyers. And by ambiguity, I mean, make sure that if you have a word that does not have a universal definition, make sure that you have defined terms in your policies for that word. It may be a word where you start it with a capital letter. It's a defined term. That term is of such significance that you're going to actually have a definition section in your policy just to make sure that no one has any doubt at all about what that word means and how it's used. That's how we try to avoid ambiguity. Sometimes there are words that have a double meaning, and avoid any ambiguity by defining certain terms if they're that important. Make sure you don't have any holes. So here's an example. Let's just think what would be a good example. Well, here's one quick example, and I'll show you this in a policy that I'm going to show you in just a second. I've got a policy that I was involved in drafting where we refer to stage testing. Now, stage testing is no longer used. As the law changes, as certain tests are used, think about a term that you can define that maybe is going to be standardized, that it's not going to change ever at some point in the future. State testing requirements, for example, and use that as your term and going through your policy rather than picking something that might change, which is SAGE testing. Another example of something where it's not a concern that the law might change, but a concern about what it means is, let's say you have a policy that is referring to a particular kind of notice. So for example, in certain attendance policies, in bullying policies, you may have a certain notice that is required to be sent. Make sure that you define the term notice. If that's helpful to you in the policy, define it with a capital N. And you can say something to the effect of notice with a capital N means, and then lay out what is required as part of that notice. Just another example of using definitions. Define terms to try to make sure that no one has any doubt about what that term means. I hope that answered your question. But if you need more examples, I can scratch my head about that a little bit more. Next, make sure that your policy is internally consistent. Make sure you don't have any internal conflict in your policy, and make sure that your policies are consistent with each other. And one way to do that is to refer to the policy. If, for example, you have a policy about dispute resolution. So if an employee or a student or parent has a grievance, and you've got some policy in place, which you should have, for how those grievances are to be resolved. Make sure that in your other policies where the issue of grievance resolution comes up, you simply refer to the school's grievance resolution policy. There's no need to restate your whole grievance resolution policy in a different policy. It's as simple as just making sure you have a reference to your grievance resolution policy in your other policy where it comes up. You can even include hyperlinks so that if someone's on your website, they're looking at one policy and it mentions the grievance resolution policy, they can click on it and it'll take them right to the other policy. IT folks are really savvy at finding a way to get all of that on your website and make sure that they're hyperlinked properly. Next, make sure that your policy is written for the correct audience. And by that, I mean, you're not writing your policy for lawyers, for example. It shouldn't be filled with a bunch of legal jargon. I've already talked about keeping it real simple. Make sure that it's readable and it's understandable for whoever it is that needs to be following the policy. If it's a school uniform policy, don't make it so complicated that your students at your school are unable to understand it. Keep it simple and make sure that your audience can follow it. And the last thing, as I alluded to a minute ago about effective policies, make sure that it's up to date. Make sure that you're reviewing your policies frequently to ensure that nothing becomes outdated in one way or another. All right, and then what to do with your policies. Your policies aren't going to be very helpful if no one knows about them. So make sure that your policies are published, first and foremost on your website. Every school's website should list out all of the school's policies. You may also want to incorporate those policies into an employee handbook, something that's distributed to your faculty and staff on the first day of class, or the first day when you get everyone together at the end of the summer. You might want to assemble all those policies for them in written form, just so that your employees don't have any doubts about what the policies are of the school. You may want to do the same thing for parents in distributing that to them at the outset of the school year. And you may do the same thing for students. If you're going to distribute certain policies to students, feel free to summarize them. Feel free to simplify them in a way that students can understand, but make sure that you're being consistent and not telling your students one thing, but having published policies that say something completely different on your website. Just make sure you're consistent across the board, even if you're summarizing from time to time, which is just fine. Next, make sure you train on your policies, and you as a business administrator, this is something you can facilitate as to all of the interested parties. As to the board, you can help encourage the board and make sure they're training on policy in their meetings. It's great for a school board to have a monthly training on policy, to have someone assigned to pick a policy and train the board on the policy, so there's no doubt about it. That could take up 5 minutes of every board meeting and can be incredibly effective. Make sure that parents are being trained, and this can happen at certain parent meetings. Make sure that the administration is, and the faculty and the staff are all trained on what the policies of the school are. And the reason this is so important is one of the main arguments that's made in lawsuits that are filed against schools, whether it's filed against the school in general, against an administrator, against a faculty member, or against a board member. All those cases have been filed in the state of Utah recently. They happen. The main thing that a plaintiff's lawyer is looking for in bringing that kind of a lawsuit is a deviation from the policy. They're looking to make sure that the school is following its policy, and if they're not, that opens the door to a lawsuit. You want to keep that door closed. You want to keep it locked shut. And the way you do that is make sure that everybody is trained on your policies after you make sure that effective policies are put in place. And then on a going forward basis, I recommend that you review your policies, you evaluate them. If, for example, one of the policies gets triggered, the grievance policy, after you've gone through the grievance process with a parent or a student or an employee, take some time to evaluate the policy. Did it work? Are there some things that probably would have been handled better and differently had we maybe had a different policy in place? And then take the opportunity to update the policy and make it better. All right, next. I want to spend some time, and this is really how I'll wrap up my discussion today, talking about something that Brian Carpenter trained on several years ago, and this comes up a lot in Brian Carpenter trainings. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Brian Carpenter. Probably most of you, if not all of you. Some people love Brian Carpenter. I've talked to some folks that maybe aren't big Brian Carpenter followers. I think he's got a lot of great material for charter schools, specifically with regard to board governance and the relationship between board and administration, which goes right along with what we're talking about today. Brian Carpenter borrows from John Carver, who has done a lot of writing on effective board governance, and Carpenter refers to him quite a bit. And one of the things that Carver came up with and that Carpenter has applied in the charter school environment is the concept of ends and means policies. I don't know how many of you have put in place or have had your board put in place ends and means policies for your school. I think it's something that's really effective. We learned about this in an article by Carver that is called and I've got this in my resources at the end of my PowerPoint here, the 7 absolutely universal, non-negotiable, unchanging principles of good charter school governance. He published that ages ago. I think it was in 2006. I read it when it came out. That was back when we were starting our charter school, and it was really helpful to us in helping define the board's role separate from the administration's role. If you haven't read it, I suggest you do. If you don't have it, you can shoot me a note. I'll give you my contact information here at the end, and I'm more than happy to email it to you. Anyway, what Carpenter talks about is what he calls and what Carver calls ends and means policies. The idea here is for the school to identify what its ends are. What is the ultimate goal that you're trying to accomplish as a school? Why do you exist, and what are you trying to do? Carpenter and Carver suggest that you identify this as a school right at the very outset, and ultimately it's the board's job to set this as a policy of the school, but certainly it's something that should happen in collaboration with the administration of the school. So first, identify the ends of the school. Secondly, identify the means. And Carpenter refers to this primarily as the must-nots, but it also includes the musts. What has to happen? What has to be done, or what cannot be done in the course of the school trying to accomplish its ends? Those are called the means. And Carpenter suggests that you put this in place in the form of actual policies, ends policies and means policies. So when I was at Canyon Rim, we took some time to do this, and I just copied here into my PowerPoint. I know this makes it really busy. I've copied into this the ends and means policies that we put in place several years ago. And here you can see my reference to SAGE tests. So this is from a few years back, and by including SAGE tests, this illustrates one of my no-nos. Although we did say formative and summative assessments, including SAGE tests, consider when you're drafting your policy something that won't be outdated. But if it does get outdated, make sure that you take the time to change it. So back to the point of ends policies. What we tried to do at Canyon Rim was lay out ends policies in three areas. First, academic ends generally. Second, instructional ends. So how the instruction actually happens in the school. And third, financial ends. So something there for the business administration side of the school that's dealing with finances. That's essential, and that's something that's the board's responsibility to make sure that there's financial oversight in the school. So we included all three of these areas in our ends policies. These aren't perfect, but we spent a full day at a retreat with the board, the business administrator, the principal and assistant principal, trying to put these together and massaging the language and trying to get it just right. And this is what we came up with. And as you can see, we tried to be as detailed as we could while still keeping it clear and concise, clear enough that anyone could read any of these and know exactly, okay, this is what the school is trying to accomplish on the academic side, the instructional side, and the financial side. And after we put in place the ends policies, we then got to the means policies. And this took a little bit more time and a few more bullet points. And so on the academic side, we put in place what has to happen and also what should not happen. We need to make sure that the administration is evaluating faculty and staff in accordance with school policy. We need to make sure that the administration is presenting a monthly report to the school board regarding student progress data. These are all the things where we thought the administration really needs to act. They need to do something in order to fulfill the ends that we'd set out for the school. Next, we put in place means policies on the instructional side and on the financial side. And you'll notice that all of this is referring to the administration. If I go back a page to the means policies on the academic side, you'll notice that this is all administration. And the reason we put it in place that way is the administration reports to the school board. And you'll notice that we did not include teachers shall or faculty shall, because it's not the board's job to oversee the faculty. That's the administration's job. And that separation is really critically important. You need to make sure that the board is not stepping on the toes of the administration by doing the administration's job, but instead by holding the administration accountable for the instruction and for the finance at the school. So it's administration will do this and administration will do that. And as we go back then to the instructional ends, and the financial ends, you can see that we have some shall not policies. So for example, here on the financial side, administration will not deviate substantially from budget line items set by the board. Okay, so that is a way that the board is able to ensure that the ends are met in a way that is an appropriate means, making sure that the budget is generally followed. We also included it as a shall not, making sure that the administration is not conducting school business in a way that jeopardizes funding, that jeopardizes the standing of the school vis-a-vis the authorizer. So anyway, this hopefully is a good illustration for you of what I think is one of the most important policies that a charter school can put in place, which is ends and means policies. This, for our school, became one of the most important governing documents for the school. In addition to the charter and the bylaws, we had the ends and means policies, the shalls and shall nots for the school. All right. Lastly, I've got on my PowerPoint here a number of different resources. I've referred to all these resources today, but I'm happy to send that out, or if anything, maybe Marie, I'll just send this to you after. And that might be the best way to go. If anyone wants to get a copy of this, or Marie, maybe you can just send it out to everybody, whatever you think.
Yep, I can take care of that.
Great. So at this point, does anybody have any questions? Anything anybody wants to bring up? Let me delete, or let me stop sharing here. And I'm interested in hearing from you if there are any questions that anybody has about anything we've covered today, or anything that I've neglected to cover today. And I hope this isn't a sign of how incredibly boring I am. I should have apologized for that in advance. I don't create PowerPoints with any icons or sounds or anything like that. So talking about policies is about as dry as it gets. But if anyone has any questions, I'd love to answer them for you.
Eric, this is Lisa from APA.
Great. Hi.
Hi, we're looking at our policies right now. We're doing them section by section each month with our board, and we're finding we have a lot of procedures in our policies, and we're a little bit concerned about maybe the additional jeopardy in having that level of detail in the policies. So if you could maybe talk to us a little bit about when it would be appropriate and when it would not be appropriate to include procedures with policies.
Yeah, it's a bit of a balance, though, isn't it? It's good to have procedures for areas where I think you run risk of not following but let me try a couple examples, Lisa. I hope this is helpful. First, it's important to have procedures where you want employees, parents, or students to jump through certain hoops to have certain recourse against the school. So for example, grievance or dispute resolution policies. I think you've got to have procedures in there. Otherwise, it could turn into a free-for-all. And you're going to have people try to, for example, short circuit going to the administration and maybe go directly to the board, or otherwise not go through all the proper channels and trying to resolve a dispute. So that's the first thing that I would make sure you have procedures for, where it's important for students, parents, faculty, or staff to go through certain steps in order to hold the school responsible for something. Where I think you may want to be, I guess the second point I'll mention, where you may want to go a little bit easier on the policies, or I'm sorry, on the procedures, is procedures that require you as a school to jump through a lot of hoops. Right? Those are areas where you don't want to set yourself up to be tripped up by imposing a whole bunch of requirements and procedures on you and how you have to get certain things done. You want to be able to maintain flexibility in dealing with problems and challenges. You just want to make sure that the policy is clear cut. So that is where I would err on the side of having fewer procedures, because you may end up creating red tape for yourself, which, as I talked about before, if not followed to the letter, to a T, you're setting yourself up for liability. So Lisa, I think you're doing the right thing in trying not to go too far and having a whole bunch of onerous procedures. And I'm not trying to suggest we want to keep this onerous for the stakeholders, but not for the school. Don't misinterpret that. But you do want to make sure that you're going light on the procedures if it's simply red tape you're creating for yourselves in what the administration or the board would have to follow. Does that help, Lisa?
Yes, that was very helpful. Thank you, Eric.
Okay. Any other questions, anyone?
I have a question. So sometimes in state statute or in the administrative rules, it says a policy must contain XYZ, and so my question is, do you think it's okay when those are pretty voluminous to not include those in the policy, but to include those in the admin procedures? So it's sort of like the policy is short. The statute says that the policy has to contain XYZ, but you include those in the procedure rather than the policy. You think that's all right?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And I didn't really refer to this. Schools can do it either of two ways. You can have, as you seem to be alluding to, a procedures manual of some kind or a book of procedures.
Yeah.
Which is all fine and well, or you can avoid that and just simply build some procedures into your policies. You can do it either way, and there are pros and cons to both. I think coming back to my discussion with Lisa just a second ago, either way, you want to make sure that you're not overly proceduralizing your school so that you've got a whole lot of red tape that you need to follow. But I don't see any problem with having a separate set of procedures from your policies. But you can also incorporate some of those procedures into your policies. And someone had a note, which I agree with, that they just put in the chat just a second ago, that yeah, there's certain policies where you have to have procedures. And you'll note that in the form policies that you find online that I directed you to, it actually includes the procedures within the policy. So that I think should serve as a good guide, that sometimes it makes sense to just have the procedure right there. Other times, going to your question, maybe it makes sense to have that procedure somewhere separate. I don't have a lot of experience there, though. I've tended to just have the policies and procedures all together in one place. Any other questions? Okay, I don't want to stifle any comment. I don't mind a long, awkward silence at all, but I just want to make sure I'm answering any questions that anybody has. So last call. Anything else? Okay.
Board Member Olson, I think that you dazzled them with your knowledge. So thank you so much. Member Olson, if you're okay, maybe we'll just hang out on the call here for a few more minutes in case anyone is shy or still kind of thinking about their question. There are lots of great messages in the chat thanking you. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here today, and we will catch you next month for our business administrator training. So have a great day, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Marie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Hey, Marie, I do have one question if I could.
Nate, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so sometimes we get a lot of questions about who ultimately is responsible for approving a policy. And I know your policy can dictate that as well. But at the end of the day, as we go through this review process and get policies approved, up to this point, we've always pushed that through our board. Is that best practice or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Now, I don't know that I said this very artfully in the training today, but the reason that we're presenting all of this to administrators is you can help in making sure that the policies are drafted, that you're finding problems that need to be addressed with policy, that you're finding problems in your existing policy that need to be updated. So that's not to say, though, that it's the administration that sets policy. That is still the board's responsibility. I'm not aware of, well, you alluded to this. Let me put it this way. In a policy, yes, the board could say that certain matters are to be decided by an administrator or by faculty, but I don't think the board can delegate out to the administration setting policy for the school. You can certainly delegate out authority to do certain things, to resolve disputes, to you name it. But ultimately, it is the board that has to set policy. I'm not aware of any exception to that. That's the board's job. Now, the board should, in pretty much every instance, consult the administrator about policy, and board meetings are designed for that, for discussion, for people to chime in, but it's still the board that has to set that policy. Does that answer your question, Nate?
Yeah, absolutely. That's very, very helpful.
Okay, great, thanks.
All right, last call for any questions. Well, Member Olson, you did a great job today. Thank you for leading out on this training. We'll go ahead and end and see you at our next board meeting.
Hey, sounds great, Marie. I'll go ahead and send my slides to you.
Thank you so much.
And as you send it out, feel free to